In 2001, Sega announced that they would cease production of the Dreamcast, and that they would be leaving the console hardware race entirely. For a lot of gamers, this was something of a rude awakening, as the company had been making consoles since 1983, and it was definitely difficult to picture a console generation without Sega. But while the Mega Drive or Genesis was their most successful game system, it was never able to capture Japan, and in fact, none of their systems ever cornered the market, often being wildly successful in one region, like Europe, Australia and Brazil, but then ignored everywhere else, like for example the Master System. Or they would find great success in Japan with the Saturn, but then be relegated to a distant third place in the West. But there's one country where no matter the system, Sega would always find a welcoming audience, more so than the US or even their home country of Japan. Sure, they may not always have claimed the #1 spot, but no matter which console Sega launched here, it would be well received and considered a heavy hitter. I'm talking of course about my home country of Portugal, a nation that always loved Sega. But why is that? What did Sega do right in Portugal that it couldn't do elsewhere? That's what we're about to look. So come and join me as we take a look at the parallel timelines that were the Portuguese console wars. Before we talk about Sega though, we have to go back and see where it all began. And in the beginning there was a Spectrum, a ZX Spectrum to be precise. Yes, we had the occasional Pong machine here and there, but as the oldest of old school Portuguese gamers where it all began, and this was it. With a machine whose biggest advantage against its competitors was not the hardware, but rather its price. This was a computer that was affordable even by Portuguese standards. It wasn't cheap per se, at least not by Portuguese wages at the time, but it was a machine that you could realistically own. I should point out that when the ZX Spectrum launched, Portugal had low wages, we had only known democracy for 8 years, and our illiteracy rate was almost 19%, with many of those who were literate only having gone as far as the 4th grade. Just to give you an idea, when the ZX Spectrum launched here, my mom was 27 years old. And when she was a child, her dad, who only had the 4th grade, was actually against sending her to school. And it was my grandmother, who had never been to school and lived all of her life being illiterate, who fought for her to get an education, and she would even get a college degree eventually. But that should give you an idea of how much of a generational gap there was. And indeed, the ZX Spectrum mostly appealed to kids, teenagers, and young adults. And even though I wasn't born yet when it launched here, it really served as a wake-up call for the younger generation of that time. I mean, just look at this thing. It's a keyboard thingamajig that you connect to your television to play video games. And you can do, whatever it is computers do. This was the stuff of American television. I mean, people didn't really know what computers did, but the media sure filled our imaginations. And now, suddenly, the future is here, in our very own bedrooms. And best of all, it wasn't even that expensive. I mean, sure, the computer itself wasn't cheap, but the games sure were. They all came in audio cassettes, which made them affordable. But the best part was that you could buy pirate games. And boy, that's exactly what we did. I mean, an official game wouldn't be that expensive, but why buy a full-priced game when the store owner could sell you the exact same game, pirated and at a fraction of the cost? Yes, you heard me, the store owner. If you wanted to buy a game, you'd go to your local gaming shop, or toy store, or tech store, and they would give you 2 sets of prices, one for the official copy, and one for the pirated copy. So yes, you could literally go to a store and be holding Jetpack on one hand, marked at full price, and then a pirate copy of that same game on your other hand for a fraction of the price. So of course you were gonna go for the cheaper one. I mean, store owners would even print their own manuals and covers, often translated into Portuguese, whereas the original games had all their documentation in English. A cheaper game and a manual in my language? Come on now, that's a no-brainer. But you know what's even funnier about all of this? It was legal! Yes, piracy was legal here up until 1988. For context, the Nintendo Entertainment System launched in America in 1985. So this means that if the NES had launched here during that period, you could pirate any NES game you'd like and Nintendo couldn't do a thing about it. So you might wonder, how did video game and console publishers handle this? And the answer is, they didn't. Sega and Nintendo simply ignored the Portuguese market, while gaming publishers didn't really bother to publish their games here. Instead, you would have importers. Any official game you'd see in a store was often imported by the store owners themselves, who would then make copies of that game, and from one official purchase they could sell 10, 20, 50, as many copies as they could. So now we get to the part you all wanna know, and that is the Sega vs Nintendo console wars. Or should I say, console war? There's a bit of a twist, but we'll get to that. First, let's check out some timelines. In 1985, the NES launched in the United States. In 1986, the NES launched in Europe and the Master System in the United States. Then, in 1987, the Master System launched in Europe. And in 1989, the Sega Genesis launched in the United States, with the Mega Drive launching in Europe the following year. So far, so good. Nothing too surprising here. Well, it's about to get interesting, because in 1990, the Master System finally launched in Portugal. Yes, that's right! The Master System launched in Portugal the same year as the Mega Drive did in Europe, and the year after the Genesis did in the US. I mean, it's kinda weird, but don't worry, because Sega wasn't alone. As in 1991, the NES launched in Portugal. Yes, that's right! The NES launched in Portugal the same year that the Super Nintendo launched in the United States. So while gamers over in America were enjoying Super Mario World, we were finally discovering Super Mario for the first time. Except it was the first Super Mario game. So yes, the 8-bit wars began in Portugal just as the 16-bit wars in the US were revving up. But what's even funnier is that in 1991 we also got the Mega Drive in Portugal, followed by the Super Nintendo in 1992. So yes, we were literally fighting two console wars at the same time. The 8-bit console wars with the Master System and the NES, and the 16-bit console wars with the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive. Both were basically wrapped into a single console generation. But you might be wondering, how does any of this work? How is the consumer supposed to react to having 4 console launches from 2 generations, all so close to one another? Well, as far as Sega and Nintendo were concerned, these weren't old consoles with old games. They're oh boy, what are they? They're budget systems. Yes, these are budget consoles. Are you poor? Well, you're a Portuguese, it's the 90s, so of course you're poor. Then why not check out our super cool, super modern budget systems with some brand new games coming out? I mean, we got games coming out, right? It's fine, don't worry about it. Now, to be fair, the Master System actually did find a new lease on life in Europe as a budget system, as new games would be released for it up until 1996. I repeat, 1996. For context, the Saturn came out in Japan in 1994. Oh, don't worry, we'll get to the Saturn. But yeah, even games like Aladdin or The Lion King, which are often associated with 16-bit consoles, would end up receiving Master System conversions. So in the end, yes, the Master System did end up being Sega's budget console in Portugal and other European countries. The NES, though, not so much. Once it died in America and Japan, that was the end of the system. Sure, it did receive a few late releases like Aladdin and The Lion King. But honestly, the less said about those games, the better. The thing is, neither Nintendo or Sega actually established offices here. Rather, they branched into third-party distributors, namely Concentra and Ecofilmes. Nintendo's partner Concentra was a toy distributor here, who often focused on the Mattel line of toys. Echo Films, on the other hand, was a movie and music distributor, meaning they also had access to the Portuguese rights for several American movies, songs, and artists, something which they leveraged to their advantage. Most people agree that Concentra was a swing and a miss. They did a terrible job at promoting Nintendo in Portugal. They didn't invest much in promotion, and their supply chain wasn't nearly as good as the competition, and it honestly seemed like they only really bothered to promote the Game Boy lineup. And in fact, the few Nintendo commercials you'd see on Portuguese television were just dubs of the same adverts you'd see in other countries. Echo Films, on the other hand, was a bit different. Much like Sega of America, they went for a far more edgy approach, which, when coupled with their higher marketing budget, better supply chain, and the fact Nintendo was not an established name here, well, let's just say that stating that Sega crushed Nintendo in Portugal is an understatement. Although it should be noted that, generally speaking, the Master System and Mega Drive's games and consoles were cheaper than their Nintendo counterparts, which also helped. After all, in a poor country, price is king. In fact, one thing they did was to redesign the covers to a lot of early Master System games so that they would be more appealing. Today, these games are known internationally as the Portuguese Purples and are highly sought after by Master System collectors worldwide. So, for example, this was the worldwide cover of My Hero for the Master System, and this is the Portuguese purple cover. By the way, does the Portuguese cover seem familiar? Well, it should, because it was taken from Bloodsport 2. They simply covered the characters' faces, added a yellow smear filter, as yes, there's nothing wrong with the picture, the game's cover really is that blurry. And suddenly, a game about a Japanese high school student trying to save his girlfriend from delinquents became subconsciously associated with the Bloodsport movies. But yes, in the end, the Master System was the official winner of the 8-bit or budget console wars. Well, I say true winner because the official winner was more than likely piracy! Yes, piracy! The true winner of the 8-bit console wars! Yes, the Master System was the most sold official system. But why buy an official 8-bit console when you can buy an NES bootleg for a fraction of the cost? And mind you, these bootleg systems were everywhere. You could literally walk into a store and see an official NES on the shelf and right next to it, a bootleg NES for a fraction of the cost. And believe it or not, these bootleg consoles and their games were sold everywhere. Not just toy stores, not just video game stores, not just tech shops, but everywhere. You'd see them in malls, grocery shops, stationery shops, candy shops, clothing stores. You could find them anywhere. Yes, they were technically illegal, but it seems like the anti-piracy authorities were more concerned with professional software and computers and not so much consoles which were viewed as toys. I remember when I was a kid, I went to the beach and I went to get a churro, and the churro place was also selling bootleg NES games. So that should give you an idea of just how far this had spread. I mean, I already created a video on how my introduction to Street Fighter 2 was not through the arcade game or the Super Nintendo or Mega Drive ports, but instead through an NES bootleg port. So yes, during the 8-bit and 16-bit generations, or again, generation, Sega wasn't just beating Nintendo, it absolutely crushed it. The only exception to this rule was the Game Boy. I guess no matter how good your marketing is, you're gonna have a hard time selling a portable console that barely lasts 3 hours and uses 6 AA batteries. It also does not help that the Game Gear was more expensive. Again, in a poor country, price is king. But now let's return to our timeline. As previously stated, we pretty much had the 8 and 16-bit generations all competing in tandem. But the thing is, Sega's success in Portugal massively improved our supply chain and launch dates. So even though most 8 and 16-bit console owners had just gotten their system 1 or 2 years ago, things were about to start all over again, as both the Saturn and PlayStation launched in Portugal in 1995. That's right, the NES and the PlayStation were both launched in my country just 4 years apart. Just Think about that for a second. And guess what? Sega, or Echo Films I should say, was not ready to drop the Master System yet. So what we had was a 3-generation console war free-for-all. That's right, a single console war that spanned 3 generations. You could literally walk up to a game store and find new releases for the Master System, NES, Mega Drive, Super Nintendo, Sega Saturn, and PlayStation. So for example, you could find the NES and Super Nintendo versions of The Lion King side by side. Or heck, I'll do you one better. How about finding Mortal Kombat 2 for the Master System, Mega Drive, and Sega Saturn all in the same store? And remember, I'm not talking about used games. These are new releases. It's kind of funny too, because if you were a kid back then, you'd have to choose on which system you were going to beg your parents for. So, are you going to beg for the brand new 32-bit system? Well then, you better be a straight-A student. Or maybe you might want to aim a bit lower for the 16-bit system. Or if your parents were particularly against video games, you might want to aim even lower for the 8-bit system. Imagine being the poor kid who could only afford an NES or Master System, while everyone else had a 16-bit or even 32-bit system. Well, actually, I don't need to imagine it, because while all of this was going on, my only gaming system at the time, besides my dad's work computer, was a bootleg Nintendo console. Yeah, remember this? This was still going. Yes, those were still being sold in stores, and that was the only system my parents were willing to buy for me at the time. Suddenly, all the NES bootlegs of games like Street Fighter 2, FIFA 97, and Donkey Kong Country make more sense, don't they? I know people online make fun of these games all the time. Hell, I made an entire series dedicated to bootlegs. But the truth is, for a lot of us, it was the only way of keeping up with new releases. Or at the very least, something that felt like a new release. So you might think that from this point on, Portugal joined the rest of the world in that the PlayStation was a massive success, leaving the N64 and Sega Saturn behind it. And while yes, that is what eventually happened, that's not how it began. The truth is, during its first 2 or 3 years in the market, the Saturn was the clear favorite. I mean, yes, it was the most expensive system and arguably the weakest, but Sega's branding was so strong here that during its first few years, everyone flocked to the Saturn, with the PlayStation being in second and the N64 a distant third. Sega, or Echo Films to be more precise, invested heavily into marketing, establishing magazines, printed advertisements, TV adverts, nationwide competitions with prizes, that sort of thing. They knew how to appeal to kids and teens in the 90s and had just the right amount of edginess for it. For example, I've already talked about the time they sponsored a Saturday morning game show where kids would compete in Sega games and with a story that makes heavy use of cyberpunk and dystopic future themes, as well as BDSM, corsets, chains, leather, and God knows what else. And yes, this was aimed at children. Echo Films would also adapt characters from other markets. For example, the UK had the Sega Pirate, whose character, style, and attitudes would be adapted into the Sega Report.
Unpleasant odors.
You have just been invaded by Sega TV.
Tonight, we bring you
Wildlife. Romance. Now that's what I call Mega CD.
Sega Report. Sega Report. Super jogos a preços que ó.
They would even occasionally bring imported games from Japan that they thought would sell well in the Portuguese market, even if they never officially launched in Europe. Like for example, when they imported the only Dragon Ball Z game the Mega Drive ever received. The funny thing is, they didn't even bother to manufacture European cartridges. They would just directly import the Japanese cards. So if you wanted to play the game, you would have to ask the store clerk for a third-party adapter that came free with your purchase. Still, while I'm praising Sega's, or rather Echo Films' branding, the Saturn's success in Portugal can also be attributed to one game. One killer app that had every kid drooling and begging their parents for a Sega Saturn. A game which, as far as I know, only ever released in Japan, France, Spain, and Portugal. And that game was Dragon Ball Z: The Legend. Yes, that's right, Sega was saved by Dragon Ball. Literally every kid wanted this game, and they begged their parents for a Sega Saturn to get it. But the funny thing is that this game also launched for the PlayStation in Japan, and yet Sony of Portugal never bothered to bring it here. I just cannot overstate enough how important this game was for the Saturn in Portugal. It was to the Saturn what Final Fantasy VII was to the PlayStation, or what Halo was to the Xbox. It was the game to get, which is kinda funny when you consider how terrible the game actually is. But at the time, none of it mattered. It was a Dragon Ball Z game, launched at the height of its popularity, and it was on a brand new 32-bit system, so the graphics and high speed had everyone drooling. Another relevant event was that in 1995, an important gaming TV show launched here. This was Tempo dos Jogos, or The Games Temple. It was basically a TV show that gave out gaming news, previews, cheat codes, and more importantly, reviews. The show seems to be somewhat inspired by the UK TV show Bad Influence. Except they removed the kids while adding some 90s edge. But what truly made it important was the fact that it focused on every system available, and didn't really play favorites. Suddenly, kids everywhere could watch gameplay videos, reviews and hear news of not just the Sega Saturn, but also the PlayStation, Nintendo 64, Mega Drive, Super Nintendo, the Game Boy, the Game Gear, and yes, even the PC. It was basically like buying a gaming magazine, except it was free and you'd get to see the game in motion. And while it greatly helped Sega, as this was where a lot of us discovered Dragon Ball Z: The Legend, it also served as a double-edged sword, because now we were being introduced to its competitors. And that's a big problem when you take into consideration that the Saturn was failing everywhere else in the world, which eventually meant that the PlayStation, N64 and PC were getting a ton of new releases while the Saturn was starting to be left behind. Sure, games like Virtua Fighter 2, Sega Rally, and Fighters Mega Mix were super popular here, but so were the Saturn versions of games like Tomb Raider and Resident Evil. Except, suddenly, the sequels were now exclusive to the PlayStation. Also, people would begin to notice that in general the PS1 and N64 had better graphics despite being cheaper systems. And this was the beginning of the end for the Saturn in Portugal. The tide was beginning to turn and it was now favoring the PlayStation. This was also not helped by the fact that in 1997 the PS1 also gained a new killer app that would doom the Saturn, something that would nullify the Saturn's greatest advantage in Portugal. And that game was Dragon Ball GT Final Bout. Yes, Sega was saved and doomed by Dragon Ball. By mid-1997, the Saturn was beginning to struggle hard. It would have a good install base, but many owners would eventually sell or shelf their Saturns and turn towards the PlayStation, which would eventually overtake Sega's console in sales and become the #1 most sold gaming system of that generation. Yes, it's true the Saturn came out swinging throughout 1995 and 1996, but it did so before the 32-bit generation could reach critical mass. By 1997, the switch began to take place, and by 1998, Portugal had elected a new favorite console. And for those of you wondering, yes, there was some interest in the N64. GoldenEye and Mario 64 definitely turned a lot of heads. But Concentra, being Concentra, did not know how to keep that momentum going or even how to promote their games, so the N64 would end up being a distant third. I would wager most Portuguese gamers of the time had never even heard of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time or Perfect Dark. So, simply put, Nintendo never stood a chance here. But as Sega struggled in the rest of the world, the Saturn's library was beginning to pale against the PlayStation's. Echo Films will try to make a comeback with the Sega Dreamcast. but it was pretty clear the Saturn hit them hard, as you would not see as many TV commercials or sponsorships as you did before. With that said, although there are no official sales numbers, I'd say anyone here would agree that in Portugal, the Dreamcast outsold the Nintendo GameCube, and most likely sold about on par with the original Xbox, which is pretty impressive when you consider that the Dreamcast was only in the market for about a year and a half. So that should be a good indicator of how strong the Sega brand was in Portugal, even after suffering through the worst years of the Saturn. But where are they now? Whatever happened to Concentra and Eco Filmes? Eco Filmes, now renamed Eco Play, left the movie and audio industry. If I had to guess, I would say because of the dwindling returns on the DVD and CD album markets. But with that said, they are still the official Sega distributor to this day, and have even expanded to now include companies like Konami, Capcom, Square Enix, Activision Blizzard, and others. Concentra held the official distribution rights for Nintendo up until 2009, at which point Nintendo decided to create offices in Portugal in conjunction with Nintendo of Spain, forming what is known today as Nintendo Iberia. So Concentra went back to being a toy distributor. As for Sony, they ruled uncontested for every generation since. In Portugal, every Sony console has consistently outsold all of its competition combined. I remember reading an article back in 2007 that in just 3 months after launching in Portugal, the PlayStation 3 sales had surpassed the lifetime sales of the Xbox 360 and Nintendo Wii combined. As for Nintendo, by the time they established offices in 2009, it was too late to save the Wii. The Nintendo Wii sales did improve in 2010, and actually outsold the PlayStation 3 for that year by a slim margin. But it just wasn't enough to make a dent, as by that time almost everyone already owned the PS3. But you would finally start to see more shelf space being dedicated to Nintendo products. The Nintendo Switch, on the other hand, is a different story. For the first time since the Sega Saturn, Sony has something that could be called competition in Portugal. The PlayStation is still by far the biggest seller, but it's not that uncommon to find Switch owners either, so the tides are slowly changing. As for the Xbox, well, I mean, it exists, but that's about all I can say. It always felt like Microsoft never made much of a push with the Xbox brand in Portugal. It received a lot of promotion when the original Xbox launched in 2001. But once the launch hype died, they never did much to promote their systems. Their games would come and go with little to no promotion or fanfare. While the rest of the world was hyped for Halo 3 or the Gears of War series, you'd be hard-pressed to find a single advertisement in Portugal. The Xbox 360 gained a cult following here, of which I was a part of. But it was super small, and they would resort to importing their games from Amazon or eBay, because the Xbox shelf space in gaming stores was nearly non-existent. And things haven't changed much since then. Sega may have left the console race 20 years ago, but I like to think that it will always hold a special place in Portugal, the country that at one point truly was a Sega land. Hey everyone, thank you for watching Stika's Retro Corner. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell and share this video, all that fun social media stuff. And you can also support me on Patreon. It may not seem like it, but even $1 is a really big help in keeping the channel going. Anyway, I hope you have a great day. Bye!